This Thursday, December 21st, we'll experience the longest night and the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice. For many people, the solstice is kind of a footnote to Christmas, doesn't it? Others aren't even particularly aware of it. When I got married on December 21st, 1996, I had no idea I was getting married on the solstice, or what the symbolism of that might be. Nor did I have any idea that I would later become a minister and would rue the decision to place my anniversary right in the middle of one of the busiest weeks of the church year. I only knew there was an ice storm that day that whittled the wedding guests down to about 25 people, including the wedding party. We had more people at our daughter's first birthday. Oh well, it turned out okay. These days I've come to appreciate the solstice and the pagan traditions around it that still infuse our other celebrations at this time of year: the Christmas tree, sprigs of mistletoe and holly, Yule logs, and songs about these things that are still sung among the Christmas carols, caroling also having its roots in ancient celebrations of the solstice. And I've noticed that, at least the way it's usually celebrated, the Christmas season without the solstice is spiritually incomplete. Have you ever stepped into a department store in December when you were in a bad mood? Or feeling terribly anxious about something? Or grieving? Did the extra loud Jackson 5 rendition of Santa Claus is Coming to Town make you want to yank the snow globes off the shelf and just chuck them through the nearest gingerbread village? Like some kind of overgrown, abominable snowman? If you're going through something tough, the Christmas season can feel like a campaign of enforced jolliness. Living through Christmas, secular and religious alike, when you're not feeling 100% cheerful, can feel like being depressed in what the Episcopal priest Barbara Brown Taylor calls a full solar church, surrounded by people who project all light and certainty. Taylor has what she calls a lunar spirituality. As she puts it, the divine light given to her waxes and wanes with the season. And she says, the way most people talk about darkness, you would think it came from a whole different deity. But no. To be human is to live by sunlight and moonlight, with anxiety and delight, admitting limits and transcending them, falling down and rising up. To want a life with only half of these things is to want half a life. Taylor decided to embrace her lunar spirituality by living for a while without using any artificial light in her home. She decided to develop a theology of sacred darkness, connecting it with things like uncertainty, anxiety, and grief by experiencing more of the actual dark. When she did this, she really started to notice the way we humans light up and chase away darkness, and the way we teach our children to avoid it too. If they're lucky enough to play freely outside, we call them in at dusk. It's getting dark, come inside, where the house is all lit, and then even when it's time to close our eyes and be in inner darkness, sometimes we light up the house with night lights in every room just in case. We've disrupted our circadian rhythms, our body's 24-hour rhythms, with all of this light. In the 1990s, there was a study in which subjects spent 14 hours per day in darkness for a month, not unlike what our ancestors would have experienced before artificial lights. It took a while for them to adjust to this, but by the end, they had settled into a new, distinctive sleeping pattern. 4 hours of sleep, then 1 or 2 hours awake, then 4 more hours of sleep. Later, the historian Roger Eckert of Virginia Tech published a book about sleep patterns. In 20 years of research, he'd found over 500 references to a similar 2-part sleeping pattern. He found it in historical documents from before the invention of artificial lights, such as court records, literature, and journals. And he also found references to some contemporary people, such as a modern-day tribe in Nigeria that also sleeps in 2 parts. Historically, the time between the two sleeps, as they're called, first sleep and second sleep, was not spent tossing and turning and trying to get back to sleep. That's how we would probably spend it now, right? But when it was normal, it was used for meditation, prayer, writing, quiet conversation, or, according to the advice of a medieval French medical text, conceiving a child better and with more enjoyment than is possible at the end of a long day. Ah, the French. It wasn't just artificial light, but also societal changes that disrupted the old sleep pattern. With an increased emphasis on productive work days, for example, the amount of time people could dedicate to rest was diminished. Just as we humans have chased away darkness without wondering what it might have cost us to do so, we also tend to devalue or try to suppress or chase away feelings associated with darkness, like fear, uncertainty, and sadness. Our avoidance of the dark is surely tied to something primal, right? Our ancestors needed to be able to see those saber-toothed tigers. But the way it translates over into other parts of our lives, like feelings and spirituality, is a reflection largely of the Christianity that has shaped our culture and its dualistic worldview. There's good and evil, God and the world, right and wrong, the flesh and the spirit. Christianity offers other spiritual pathways beyond duality, and you can especially see this in some of the non-canonical scriptures, but that's not what became mainstream. Meanwhile, in Christianity's course of growth, it overtook other traditions that had other kinds of wisdom that we would do well to remember. Pagan traditions. Pagan is an umbrella term. It covers indigenous, earth-based traditions, including those of Western Europe before the time of Christianity. In the Druid tradition of that region, the winter solstice ceremony is known as Alban Arthen. Arthen comes from Arthur, and Alban means white or light. So it means, poetically speaking, the light of Arthur. Alban Arthen celebrates the ritual story of a sun god, S-U-N God, Arthur, who dies and is reborn as the sun, S-O-N, of light at the winter solstice, becoming the savior of the British Isles. If the birth of a son who is a savior reminds you of another story, well, you're right. The Christian nativity story is one variation on one of humankind's oldest, most common stories. The Druids traditionally held, and modern-day Druids still hold, their solstice ceremonies outdoors when possible, preferably with a view to the locations of the rising and setting of the winter solstice sun. Participants tie black strips of cloth to their clothes to symbolize mourning. The ceremony begins with wishing peace to the four corners of the earth, the four directions, and then purification and consecration of the circle, or ceremony space, with water and fire. The ceremony continues with participants acting out a ritual questioning in which the youngest one, Mabon, questions the ancient one. Mabon's also the name given to the new young sun, S-U-N, that will be reborn after the longest night of the solstice. Teach us, wise ancient, to what period of time we have come, says the young one. And the ancient replies, we show to you, young one, the birth of the youngest one, who bears your name, who is born in silence and weakness as the smallest of lights. The people acknowledge that the time has come to mourn what's coming to an end and what is dying. The dark night of solstice is connected with, and it makes a space for, the dark nights that are part of our spiritual lives, times when we may feel lost, unable to see or imagine what's ahead, or afraid that things will never get better. The oak is bare, the earth is cold, the sky is black. From where could hope arise, one elegist says. The cold and dark have grown strong. We mourn the passing of the bright days, says another. And soon all light is turned off or extinguished, and the ceremony is plunged into darkness. The people meditate, held in the dark and the silence. They practice letting go of what has ended. They prepare themselves for the return of the light. By embracing the dark and entering fully into it, they embrace not just half a life, but the whole of it. The sacred balance, which includes the sacred dark. Finally, participants remove the symbols of mourning from their clothes, and a lantern is lit at the place of the solstice sunrise. Then other lights are kindled from that first one, symbolizing the one source of all life, light, and love from which we are all born. Mistletoe, representing darkness and growth, is brought from the north and joined with oak, the tree of eternity and of the present moment. And together they're passed to each participant as a symbol of healing. The ceremony, taking place at the end of the darkest day of the year and the beginning of the return of the light, marks both a completion and a new beginning. In this way, it's about deeply entering into a particular moment, a turning moment. Solstice means stand still. Like the pause in our breath after each exhalation, the earth seems to stand still for a moment at solstice. Before Christianity swept over Europe, people throughout the Western countries there celebrated the solstice with food and evergreen boughs, holly, and especially fire and light. Festivities could go on for nearly 2 weeks, a tradition that carried over into what we now call the 12 days of Christmas. The Romans called it Saturnalia, and right around the time Christianity was taking root there, the Romans were already celebrating what they called the birthday of the unconquered sun, S-U-N, on December 25th. In the north, the Norse people had Yule for their celebration, and some linguists believe Yule may be the root of the word jolly. The Christian scriptures don't actually say when Jesus was born. Some scholars, noting clues like shepherds watching over their flocks at night, believe the stories were meant to take place in the spring. But in the 4th century, the Roman Catholic Church strategically made the official birth date December 25th, same as the birthday of the unconquered sun. People were already used to celebrating the birth of a hero that day, after all. The challenge was reminding them that they were now supposed to celebrate a different one, because they kept up with their old traditions of the holly, the ivy, the evergreen trees, the caroling, feasts, and fire, which sometimes did worry church officials. Indigenous traditions in other parts of the world, including New Mexico, also involve solstice stories and ceremonies. When a particular kind of ritual is so ubiquitous, so everywhere, you know we're onto something important. The public intellectual and pagan theologian Starhawk writes that when we reject the dualism that separates the world into light and dark, good and bad, it's healing. Instead of enlightenment, she says, we begin to speak of deepening. We remember that in the old myths, the entrance to the realm of the spirit was through the fairy mound, the cave, the crack, the fissure in the earth, the gate, the doorway. We call it the underworld, and we go within it for our visions. The dark is a place of changing consciousness. The dark, she says, is all that we are afraid of, all that we don't want to see: fear, anger, sex, grief, death, the unknown. Starhawk includes sex in this list because it's a sacred source of power and joy, but also the obsession of those who want power over. Sexuality is a life-affirming gift, and it is the locus of conflicted feelings, shame, repression, and violence. Out of the darkest point of winter, spring is being born. As another pagan author, Diane Stein, puts it, the experience of nothingness, of death, is changed to the experience of new being, where everything is wonderful and possible. Birth and rebirth are common metaphors for the turning of solstice. Actually, birth is most wonderful in hindsight, right? It's really intense while it's happening. for the person giving birth, and I would imagine for the person who's being born. There's a point in natural labor called transition, characterized by time distortion, feeling out of control, fogginess, disorientation, and self-doubt. Well, those feelings sound a lot like what we might experience during a very hard time in our lives, too, don't they? Feeling out of control, foggy, disoriented, self-doubt, and like it's been going on forever and it might never end, time distortion. But it's impossible to skip over the hard part, over what scares us and can transform us. In solstice ceremonies, we know the light's coming, but we can't get there without going through the dark first. There's important work to be done in not just being cheerful or just being hopeful. The wisdom of the solstice is that the dark, too, is important and that it does not last forever. Then, when we have experienced the dark, when we have recognized what we need to let go of, we can give thanks for the important purpose it served, and then let it go. In ritual, at least, in intention, in prayer, and in our hearts. Letting go might not take effect immediately. Brenda Cole is a member and a volunteer leader in our congregation, and she's also ordained in the Druid tradition. As part of my research for today's sermon, she agreed to share some of her knowledge about the Druid tradition and the solstice. Thank you, Brenda. I saw you out here somewhere. And one thing that Brenda said really stayed with me. She said that the hard part about letting go of something is trusting that there will be anything there to fill that space. The hard part of letting go of something is trusting there will be anything there to fill that space. This can be true whether it's a relationship, a job, or a role we've had, a routine or a habit, a feeling that has powered us through a phase in life, intense grief for a loss that is now well behind us, or something else. When it's time to let go of these things, we know because they become uncomfortable, or they're no longer life-giving or affirming, or no longer suit us or serve our well-being. We sense they're holding us back. But sometimes we hold on to something uncomfortable because we're afraid of what comes next, and we're especially afraid of having nothing at all to replace it. So it takes trust. It takes faith in the cycle of life, and it might take multiple attempts. We can let go of something in ritual only to find ourselves holding on to it again a little bit later. And letting go is a process that we repeat. But the ritual helps. It moves us along spiritually into the next thing, and it helps us to make room for the new. There are many pagan solstice ceremonies happening in Albuquerque, and there's even a pagan group here within our congregation called CUPS, the Covenant of UU Pagans. But if you aren't a part of a larger group, the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids in England suggests some simple ways to honor the solstice on your own. They suggest that on the longest night, you turn out all the lights and spend some time experiencing darkness. Then light a candle and go through your home lighting other candles from that first one in each room. You can decorate an altar with mistletoe, or notice where the sun enters and leaves your home at this time of year. They suggest that you travel by tube, meaning the subway in England. I guess you won't be doing that unless you have big travel plans. But it's the experience of going underground and reemerging that they're inviting you to notice. You could act that out in other ways, too. Or try a dance or movement meditation, beginning by lying down in meditative silence and then awakening by rising or stirring, moving, and then even dancing to some enlivening music. I'll bet you can think of some other ways to mark the solstice, too. This solstice, wherever you are in your life journey, may you experience the clarity you need in order to make room for what is waiting to be born in your life. If you are experiencing grief of any kind, May you take comfort in the embrace of winter dark and receive what you need from it as you wait for the sun to reappear. Whoever you are, wherever you are, may you receive the invitation to deepening in whatever way you are called this wintry week. Our closing song is in the turquoise hymnal. It's number 1063, the Winter Solstice